Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Emma Briggs, and I am here to discuss with you some of the work that Colorado State has been working on, and mostly its involvement around pulmonary arterial pressure with its relationship with feedlot growth, intake, and carcass traits. For decades, we have seen hypoxia-induced pulmonary hypertension cause right ventricle failure and can lead to the manifestation of high mountain disease, or often commonly referred to as brisket disease. Previously, this was considered a regional concern within the beef industry. In geographical regions above 5,000 feet, high-altitude disease is an epidemic which causes about 5% of cattle residing in these areas to die annually from pulmonary hypertension. Within the past few decades, we have seen what was once a regional concern in the high area of the Rocky Mountain ranges and other high elevation regions now become more of a national concern as we see cattle entering the feedlots with symptoms that resemble pulmonary hypertension. So what our main concern here is that as cattle come from these high elevation regions, how are they performing in these lower elevation feedlots, and how does that relationship between pulmonary arterial pressure with feedlot performance traits as well as carcass traits intertwine themselves, and what type of information can we learn if we can establish the genetic relationship between those traits? In order to identify animals who are susceptible to pulmonary hypertension or could be suffering from pulmonary hypertension, we're able to use pulmonary arterial pressure, or PAP, as phenotypic measurement. And when we talk about animals who are at risk, we talk about them as what is the likelihood of this animal developing pulmonary hypertension themselves, or being at risk for having a genetic predisposition to develop the disease of pulmonary hypertension. So how we collect pulmonary arterial pressure, it is of course a chute-side procedure which is conducted by a licensed veterinarian. And what happens is that a bore needle is placed into the jugular of the animal, and then a catheter is threaded down the jugular until we get to that right atrium, and continues down into that right ventricle until we get into that pulmonary artery, and it's there within that pulmonary artery where that mean pulmonary arterial pressure is collected. Normally, these animals who are tested for pulmonary arterial pressure are animals who are considered in areas which are susceptible to the development of pulmonary hypertension. We would consider this to be about 5,000 feet in elevation or greater. Typically, we would want to see animals who are tested over 10 to 12 months of age, as it is a more indicative presence of understanding of that animal is potential to develop pulmonary hypertension. And what happens in these areas of high elevation is that we see these low oxygen levels, which can cause acute hypoxia as well as vasoconstriction in the pulmonary vasculature. Once these animals succumb to pulmonary hypertension, we see that these animals suffer from pulmonary vasculature remodeling as well as cardiac, structural, and functional changes. We can see here in this picture on the left-hand side, we see that that heart has just lost completely its apex shape. It's more of a round basketball, and we can see the structural changes between that right ventricle and that left ventricle in that cross section, as well as the graphic pictured on the right, where we can see the constriction of those blood vessels and the structural changes that happen when an animal succumbs to pulmonary hypertension. And this is normally conducive to ending in heart failure, which leads the animal to be deceased. Now, I mentioned previously that we see cattle both in areas of high elevation as well as moderate elevation suffering from what appears to be pulmonary hypertension. And so how can we identify animals who have high pulmonary arterial pressure? Well, we can see it especially in figure A. We see that large brisket edema in those cattle caused by the hydrostatic pressure due to that right ventricle failure. You can see clearly the difference between a systematic calf as well as an unaffected calf. These animals are also very lethargic. We see decreased appetites in these cattle quite often, as well as in figure B, you can see the large jugular distension in that animal. Overall, not necessarily a very healthy looking animal. So a lot of the question is that how can we evaluate this PAP score that we receive when we PAP test our animals, and how can we use that to identify what animals are at low risk or will be better suited for different elevation operations. So pulmonary arterial pressure, or PAP score, is measured in what we consider millimeters of mercury, and there are different ranges of this score for which animals can be placed into. So we see on one end, we see our lower scores. That's going to be something below 39 millimeters of mercury. And those animals are going to be considered at low risk for developing pulmonary hypertension in any of the segregated feet of elevation that we have established here. On the other hand, we see that animals who have pulmonary arterial pressure scores of over 50 millimeters of mercury, those animals are going to be considered at moderate risk for developing pulmonary hypertension in areas between 4,000 to 500 feet or even below 4,000 feet, and are considered at high risk when we put them in areas that are going to be above 5,000 feet elevation. Now here we have listed various genetic correlations that have already been previously established with pulmonary arterial pressure measurements with a variety of traits that are most important to the beef industry. We see everything from our birth and weaning weight, both the direct and the maternal value, as well as moving into some of our other growth traits, post-weaning gain, and looking into a few ultrasound traits that have been established back in 2017, looking at the genetic relationship, trying to understand how pulmonary arterial pressure is established with traits that are rise a lot of importance within the industry. So why do we want to measure feedlot performance? Well, of course, it is a measurement of inputs to outputs, as well as extreme economic importance within especially that sector of the beef industry, along with the fluctuation of feed cost, the increase in population, the environmental issues, as well as decrease in available land and resources. We see that as we can decrease feed costs, we can increase our profitability within the industry, and one fabulous way to do that is through analyzing the performance of cattle in that feedlot sector. Within the cattle industry, feedstuffs are considered extremely important as they represent up to 70% of the total cost of production. So through genetic improvement, efficiency can decrease production costs, as well as premiums for higher carcasses, as well as increase in popularity in branded beef programs has really drawn a lot of interest of genetic merit to carcass traits as well. Currently, very little research has been conducted to evaluate the genetic relationship between pulmonary arterial pressure with feedlot and carcass performance. Because of this, little is known regarding of the potential genetic relationship that could exist between these traits. Now, this comes into importance when this could potentially drive disadvantageous results from multiple trait selection. Many producers in areas of high elevation have made continuous selection against high PAP but as we see the American Angus Association developing a PAP-EPD and many other breed associations developing similar genetic evaluations, it's considered essential to understand the potential antagonisms that could exist between these traits. In order to evaluate these traits, we conducted an analysis and evaluated both the heritability and the genetic correlations of these traits. Of course, the heritability is going to measure the strength of relationship of the phenotypic and the genotypic values of that trait, while that genetic correlation is going to evaluate the breeding values for one particular trait and as they relate to the other particular trait. In order to obtain the heritabilities and genetic correlations for each trait included in this analysis, we decided to run a series of 5 trait models using ASReml to evaluate the potential genetic relationships between pulmonary arterial pressure, feedlot performance, as well as carcass traits. For each model, pulmonary arterial pressure, average daily gain, average dry matter intake, and weaning weight were included in every model, and therefore were reported as the average estimate for both heritability and genetic correlations, followed by the highest standard error calculated throughout the series of the 5 trait models. Alternatively, a single carcass trait was alternated throughout the series of 5 trait models, and in this study, the carcass quality traits that we decided to include were ribeye area, marbling score, back fat, hot carcass weight, and calculated yield grade. Cattle used for the study came from the Colorado State University Beef Improvement Center, spring calving herd, located near Saratoga, Wyoming, with approximate elevation of around 2,115 meters. We were able to collect over a span of about 20 years, 6,869 PAP observations, with an average test age of 327 days. Following weaning, 558 steers over the course of 5 years were brought down from the Beef Improvement Center to evaluate their feedlot performance using the GrowSafe monitoring systems at the Colorado State University Feed Intake Unit located in Fort Collins, Colorado. Using those GrowSafe monitoring systems, we were able to obtain cattle's dry matter intakes for evaluation of this project. Steers from the CSU Beef Improvement Center were finished at the Eastern Colorado Research Center located in Akron, Colorado, with an approximate elevation of 1,420 meters. From here, we were able to collect 1,627 carcass records from these steers, and they had an average kill age of 578 days. Again, the traits that we decided to include in this analysis were ribeye area, marbling, back fat, hot carcass weight, as well as calculated yield grade. Here we have listed in this table every trait that was included in the analysis of the series of 5 trait models. We have pulmonary arterial pressure, weaning weight, average daily gain, average dry matter intake, ribeye area, marbling score, back fat, hot carcass weight, and calculated yield grade. As we move down this table, we see the averages that are associated for those traits, as well as that standard deviation, followed by that range for each individual trait. Briefly looking at the summary statistic table, we see that our averages fall fairly well within the previously reported industry traits, especially for Angus cattle coming from our geographical region. As we move on to more results of this study, here we have listed a table which describes the relationship between pulmonary arterial pressure with our performance traits. Along this diagonal, we see the heritabilities for each trait included for this table. We see that pulmonary arterial pressure was moderately heritable at about 0.2, and this was within the range of previously reported results, especially within Angus cattle. As we move down to our feedlot performance traits, we see that they were both moderately heritable, with average daily gain being at around 0.42 and average dry matter intake being 0.29. Looking at our genetic correlations between our feedlot performance traits and our pulmonary arterial pressure, we see a fairly low genetic correlation between average daily gain and PAP at about 0.03. Alternatively, average dry matter intake has a more substantial genetic correlation at about 0.32. These results would suggest that cattle with higher PAP scores would be the traditionally less efficient animals at converting feed when compared to lower PAP contemporaries. Potentially, these animals could be less efficient due to their poor cardiopulmonary function, causing a lack of efficiency, and this could also be independent from the animal's fat content as well as their structural size. Moving on to our carcass traits, here we have outlined the relationships between our pulmonary arterial pressure with the included carcass traits in this model. As we look down the diagonal of this table, we see that our carcass traits are moderately heritable, followed by fairly low standard errors, and are within the industry averages that we would expect these heritabilities to be at, especially for this particular research herd. Shifting our eyes from the diagonal up into that top row, where we can see that genetic correlations between pulmonary arterial pressure with our included carcass traits, we see a fairly widespread of genetic correlations. So we see ribeye area being at a negative 0.30, with marbling being fairly correlated at 0.01, back fat negative 0.07, hot carcass weight 0.15, and calculated yield grade 0.29. Now, the negative correlations between pulmonary arterial pressure with the ribeye area, back fat, and hot carcass weights suggest that cattle with high pulmonary arterial pressures may not be directly related to those larger, fatter framed cattle that we see in the feedlots, which some research has preluded to being the majority of the issue for cattle who are succumbing to pulmonary hypertension in these moderate elevation feedlots. It's from these results here in this table which we could suggest that cattle with high PAPs could just be overall less efficient animals. This would generally cause marginal carcass quality when these cattle are brought from high elevation to these moderate elevation feedlots for finishing. So trying to wrap this up and bring in some conclusions here, we see that high elevation cattle with high pulmonary arterial pressures, when we bring them down into moderate elevation feedlots, they suffer from poor cardiopulmonary health, poor feed efficiency, as well as poor carcass quality. The more substantial genetic correlations between pulmonary arterial pressure with average dry matter intake suggests that cattle with higher PAP scores coming into these feedlots could be less efficient at converting feed when compared to their low PAP score contemporaries. Once again, we look at our correlations between pulmonary arterial pressure with our carcass traits. We see that the relationship between PAP and calculated yield grade, ribeye area, back fat, and hot carcass weight suggests that potentially lower PAP cattle could result in producing heavier muscled, leaner carcasses when compared to their high PAP cattle contemporaries. Now, these results could suggest that high PAP cattle could be potentially using excess energy towards their cardiopulmonary vasculature system, resulting in these animals which are less feed efficient when put in moderate elevation feedlot settings, that finish out with marginal carcass quality and an overall decreased quality animal. Now, what does this mean for the beef industry? As high mountain disease has manifested itself into cattle operations in the mountainous regions for quite a few years now, we see that these operations are utilizing the phenotypic selection of pulmonary arterial pressure to develop cattle which are better adapted to these high elevation regions, decreasing their herd's risk of developing pulmonary hypertension. So these results of this analysis suggest that the continuous selection against high PAP cattle using these phenotypic measurements will not necessarily negatively impact the subsequent generations' feedlot and post-harvest performance. Unfortunately, looking at these results as well, we could suggest that cattle who are culled from these operations because of high PAP scores are then sold or moved to a more moderate elevation operation could have the potential for a decrease in feedlot performance as well as lighter muscled carcass when they are transferred. As popularity in this beef industry is driven by cattle efficiency and adaptability, this information can aid producers at high elevations as they select for traits to include in their individual breeding objectives. And these findings both support and advocate that feedlots can purchase cattle from high elevation producers with selection pressure for pulmonary arterial pressure in their herd and in their individual breeding objectives without subsequently having undesirable feedlot and post-harvest trait performance. And this concludes the remaining of my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.
The state of Iowa and Iowa State University are proud to host the 2021 Beef Improvement Federation Annual Research Symposium and Convention. The convention will be located in downtown Des Moines with easy access to the airport, hotels, and local restaurants. Iowa State University is just north with its research and teaching farms. Join us in Iowa and experience how Iowa provides the beef industry with innovation to application.